Drive Time on BCFM 93.2.
Now, as promised, what would a major euro-dollar crash look like? Old Labour Oxford economist Martin Summers. First of all, I mean, we're looking at a sort of a couple of scenarios here. Looking at what would trigger it, what would the financial crash actually look like on the day, what would it look like after a few days, after a few weeks, and what would a long-term recovery look like? So, first of all, the trigger, possibly a military incident, maybe real weapons of mass destruction on a city, a nuclear weapon, chemical weapons, biological weapons, possibly, something like a United States aircraft carrier being sunk. But the important thing is this is sending a message around the world of kind of TV pictures of shock.
Yeah, I mean, when we had the crash in 1987, it was pictures of a burning oil rig in the Gulf, which caused the immediate shock. But of course, the fact is that we are on the brink of major wars, and that they do cause crashes. I mean, in the first weeks of the First World War, the stock market collapsed. But of course, the market can collapse under its own steam, as we've just been hearing. With or without a military provocation, it can just collapse anyway.
But I think what we've been discussing over previous weeks is that we're building up to a situation, particularly in the Middle East. Elsewhere, there's the North and South Korea tension. There's tension between China and Japan. But in any of these situations, it wouldn't take a lot to actually trigger a euro crisis to actually turn into a crash, and that's one of the things that has been one of the kind of unintended consequences of this whole euro crisis that's been rolling on the last couple of years. Is it's led to a situation where something else might intervene to really tip it over the edge.
Well, there's a whole spectrum of things which could tip it over the edge, and that's why I firmly predict that it will be tipped over the edge, because something or other will turn up and cause it. And it's interesting that you call it a euro-dollar crash. Now, that is good, because that actually is the point. It's not about the euro, it's about the banking system. If an individual country, even Cyprus, which is worth 0.2% of European GDP, crashes out of the euro, that will bring credit default swaps, which are owned by banks in Germany and Britain, for example, into play. And at that point, you get a catastrophic failure of the system. This is one of the arguments, for example, against nuclear power. It's a complicated system, and if it breaks down, as we saw at Fukushima, you then get a completely uncontrollable situation. Now, what we've allowed to happen in the financial markets is exactly that. We've been building this bonfire now for 30 or 40 years, piling more pallets on it, throwing more petrol on it, and now, of course, we're striking matches next to it. Now, of course, this bonfire should never have been built. The separation, for example, between retail banking and investment banking was brought in the 1930s in the US, Britain and elsewhere, precisely to avoid this kind of situation. But Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, the Conservative Party here, the Republicans in the United States said, oh, no, we don't need that kind of old-fashioned regulation anymore. Why don't we just bring it all into one big bonfire? And, of course, if you bring it all into one big bonfire, that big bonfire can catch fire, and that's the problem.
OK, well, the military incident, one of the reasons I mention it is because it actually would be quite convenient for the financial powers to be able to then say, oh, well, actually, it wasn't our fault, it was the fault of this military incident.
Indeed, and this is why I think we shouldn't concentrate too much on it. You see, Cyprus, for example, is a financial incident, but it's also a military incident because the Russians are basically being drawn into fighting in Syria. It's the Russians who've got their money in Cyprus, and the Russian businesses and the oligarchs and so on who may have lost their money. But of course, Cyprus has got gas, so then they were talking with Gazprom about having some gas, and it's also been hinted that Putin was saying, well, can we have some bases in Cyprus? Now, can you imagine if the British are kicked out of Cyprus, the Russians put their bases in, ready for the war in Syria? Now, the point is that all of these things are actually working together. The military situation and the financial situation are both on red alert as we go into the spring of 2013.
Okay, leaving the trigger and looking at the financial crash itself, stock markets would be very quickly, and there would be a kind of contagious collapse because of the electronic nature of these things. There would probably be insider dealing, large amounts of money to be made at this point. Have insiders put their money out of the casino, out of shares and cash, into commodities and property? Well, yes, they have. A lot of money has been going into gold, Hong Kong property, classic cars, fine art, rare coins, stamps, fine wine and jewellery. Markets would be quickly suspended and banks would close their doors almost immediately. Nowadays, that would be almost instantaneous. Cash points would either quickly run out of cash or simply be closed by the banks. Card transactions may be suspended immediately too. That means eventually you can't get at your money. Your savings, can't use it for anything. food, or for example to buy a large item like car insurance, tax, your bills, you wouldn't be able to pay them, but the government says don't panic, Corporal Jones.
Well, of course, that's the government's job, is to say don't panic, and in a sense you expect them to say that. But the fact of the matter is that they've had 4 years since the 2008 credit crunch to get the house in order. They should have basically, if they're going to prop the banks up, you go in there and kick them to pieces, arrest the top people, send them down, take all their money off them, and you really get a grip on the situation. But we haven't got a grip on the situation. The politicians basically are bought by the bankers, and that includes the left-wing politicians as well as the right-wing politicians. So we've had 4 years of hanging around while they carry on looting. And of course what will eventually happen is they will walk away with the loot. But of course the society as a whole will then bear the consequences. I mean world society will then bear the consequences. And of course all of the brushfire wars that are burning out of control will then get a whole slash of petrol on top of them, and off we'll go.
Okay, well, we've had a look at the trigger and the financial crash, but what would things be like after a few days? Now, we've identified this as rather a crucial point. Will the authorities get a grip? This is the question. On the positive side, they could do. What would the government be doing if they did? Well, they would be taking over the banks. There would be maximum daily withdrawals immediately from cash points. National currency controls, probably best set in before the crash. They would be printing and distributing cash to banks to make sure that there was enough available. Food would be distributed. There'd possibly be overprints of the euro notes in other parts of Europe. But on the negative side, there may be an escalation on the military side, false flag attacks and this kind of thing. There may be panic and bad analysis. In other words, a lot of stuff coming through the media which is really trying to divert the blame for this. Also, state of emergency possibly even coming in quite quickly. Even an invasion and war breaking out in the Middle East. On the negative side still, I mean, it may be that there's a long time before we can get at any cash. There may be looting and civil unrest quite quickly, possibly even guns on the streets and mob rule. Whereas, in that case, people would immediately pretty much start bartering and sharing things. We may even have the institution of Emergency Powers Act, Martin, and Civil Contingencies Act.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you look at what happened in Argentina in 2001, the banks closed, the corralito, nobody could get their money out. People lost their money, as may still happen in Cyprus. And people did start bartering. There was lots of civil unrest. People looted supermarkets, but eventually it led to political change. And the Kirchner administration, the husband rather than the wife, turned around to the IMF and said, you know what? We're not going to pay the money we owe, and you will negotiate with us about how we're going to deal with this, because otherwise we're not going to pay anything and we'll bring down the entire banking system. They had the backbone to stand up to the bullies in Wall Street and London. Now, ultimately, of course, this is what needs to be done, and we need the political will to stand up to these people.
But the ultimate question, I mean, this is the point at which our two scenarios diverge, Martin. We've got the positive one where the government does get a grip, and a negative one where everything starts running out of control. What's your prediction there?
Well, I have to be honest. Basically, I think if you're honest, it's likely that this is going to be way out of control and nobody's going to be able to stop it. But we have to have pessimism of the intelligence and optimism of the will. World wars tend to actually force people to confront reality.
Okay, the next stage is after a few weeks. New currencies would start forming, possibly even currencies like the Bristol pound might start becoming circulated if there's no cash around. Things like McDonald's vouchers, food vouchers, which are valued at food banks, suddenly these things start to become currency. But then there, of course, would be, after a few weeks, waves of bankruptcies, as the banks would be calling in security to try and recapitalise themselves. And many companies going bankrupt, probably apart from the big multinational chains. There would be mass layoffs, mass unemployment, and most people would simply not be able to pay the rent or mortgage. That's when things start getting difficult.
It does, yeah. I mean, what we really need is, as Michael Meach was saying in the first hour, we need a Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which is exactly what Obama should have been. He's been elected twice now. He's the guy that should have been putting all this in place, ready to go. But of course, he's in the pocket of the bankers like they all are, and nothing has been done, which is why it'll probably play out on the negative scenario rather than the positive scenario. The positive scenario required effort to have been made already, and it hasn't been done.
Well, we don't know that. Maybe they have worked on some of this at the Treasury.
They haven't done anything. They haven't done any of the necessary things. I mean, we've just been hearing from our colleague there about the total lack of regulation in the City of London. We've had 4 years to get something in place, and nothing's been done.
Okay, well, more long-term recovery. If this is really, we're talking months and years after working with the BRICS countries, doing big building projects, getting people back into work through government spending on infrastructure, building houses. But I mean, ultimately, it looks like we may have to have a government-run kind of socialist world until private businesses are able to build back up again. Either that, or much of our life will be run by private multinationals.
No, the problem is the system is chaotic to the point where it can't survive. Capitalism is going to die. The question is what comes after capitalism. It's a dead donkey. You can beat it with a stick, but it ain't going to get up. And of course, the powers that be have deluded people for the last 4 years that capitalism's still alive. I've got a secret to tell you. It's not alive. It's dead already.
Well, that's it. You've just heard our question. What would a major euro-dollar crash look like? And you've had a couple of scenarios there. First, with the trigger for it. Secondly, with the actual crash itself. Thirdly, after a few days, what it would look like. Then after a few weeks. Then after a few months. And finally, the Treasury can't say they didn't have a plan. We just broadcast it.
Drive Time on BCFM 93.2.